In the early 2000s, a researcher and explorer named Dan Bietner partnered with National Geographic and a team of demographers, doctors, and anthropologists to answer one question. Where on Earth do people live the longest, healthiest lives, and why? They didn't start with a theory. They started with data, birth records, death records, population statistics from around the world, looking for places where an unusually high number of people were living past 90, past 100, while staying mobile, independent, and largely free of the chronic diseases that define old age almost everywhere else. 5 places kept showing up: the island of Okinawa, Japan; a mountainous region of Sardinia, Italy; the Greek island of Ikaria; the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica; and a community of Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. They called them blue zones, named simply for the blue circles the researchers drew around them on a map. What happened next is the part most people don't know. The team didn't just measure these populations from a distance. They moved in. They lived alongside residents for months at a time. They interviewed people who'd been alive since before World War I. They tracked daily routines hour by hour, what people ate, how they moved, who they spent time with, what they believed gave their life meaning. And here's what they didn't find. No blue zone population was taking a special supplement. None had access to advanced medicine the rest of the world didn't. None were eating some rare superfood unavailable anywhere else. What they found instead was a set of repeatable behaviors, small, almost boring habits, repeated daily for decades, that nobody outside these communities was doing on purpose. In the next 50 minutes, we're going to walk through exactly what those 5 habits are, what the research says about why each one works, where the evidence is strong and where it's still uncertain, and at the end, what an ordinary day actually looks like when someone builds all 5 into their life at once. Before going habit by habit, it's worth spending a few minutes on something most longevity content skips entirely. How do we actually know any of this is true? This matters because claims about the secret to long life are everywhere online, and almost none of them are backed by anything more rigorous than a personal anecdote. The Blue Zone's research is different in one specific way. It started as a demographic verification project before it became a lifestyle study. To even qualify as a Blue Zone candidate region, researchers had to verify ages through multiple independent records, birth certificates, religious baptismal records, marriage records, sometimes military service records. Because self-reported age among the very old is notoriously unreliable. People exaggerate. Records get lost. In some cultures, there's even social status attached to extreme old age, which creates an incentive to round up. This verification step matters enormously. And we'll come back to it later in this video. Because in 2024, a researcher named Saul Justin Newman published an analysis arguing that several so-called longevity hotspots around the world, in some cases overlapping with Blue Zone regions, showed patterns more consistent with poor record keeping, missing documentation, or even pension fraud than genuine biological longevity. His work won an Ig Nobel Prize, specifically for highlighting how shaky some extreme old age claims really are. We're not going to pretend that controversy doesn't exist. We'll address it properly near the end of this video, because an honest documentary doesn't cherry pick the flattering parts of the research and ignore the rest. But, and this is the important part, even accounting for that controversy, a separate and more rigorously controlled body of research backs up the core lifestyle findings independently of the original Blue Zones project. Most notably, the New England Centenarian study at Boston University, led by Dr. Thomas Perls, has tracked centenarians using strict, verified documentation for over 2 decades specifically to avoid the record-keeping problems Newman identified. So what does that more rigorous research say about nature versus nurture? Twin studies, research comparing identical twins who share virtually all their genes, raised in different environments, consistently estimate that genetics explains somewhere around 20 to 30% of the variation in how long people live. The rest is overwhelmingly behavior, environment, and to some extent, plain luck. That 20 to 30% is not nothing, but it means that for most people, the majority of the long life equation is sitting in front of you every single day in the form of decisions you're already making. What you eat, how you move, who you spend time with, what you do with your time. That's the part this video is actually about. Let's get into it. Here's the first thing that surprised the original research team. Almost none of the centenarians they studied exercised in the way that word is normally used. They didn't have gym memberships. They didn't follow workout programs. Many had never run on a treadmill or lifted a weight in their entire lives. What they did instead was move constantly in small amounts as an unavoidable side effect of how their daily environment was built. In the mountain villages of Sardinia, a huge proportion of the male centenarians studied had spent most of their working lives as shepherds, walking miles of steep, uneven terrain every single day, often well into their 80s and 90s, simply because that was the job and there was no alternative way to do it. In Okinawa, the tradition of home gardening continues for life, and there's a small but meaningful detail researchers noted. Okinawan gardens are traditionally tended while sitting or kneeling directly on the ground, not standing at a raised garden bed, the way many Western gardens are designed. That means residents are getting up and down off the floor dozens of times throughout the day, year after year. Separately, researchers studying mobility and aging have found that the ability to get up off the floor unassisted is one of the strongest predictors of independence and fall risk in older adults. And it's a movement pattern. Most people in modern chair and couch-centered homes simply stop practicing by their 40s or 50s, long before they need to. There's a term for this kind of incidental movement: NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It covers all the energy your body uses that isn't a structured workout. Walking to a neighbor's house instead of driving, climbing stairs instead of taking an elevator, gardening, cleaning, carrying groceries, standing instead of sitting. Research on activity patterns across different populations has found that NEAT can vary enormously between individuals, in some studies by the equivalent of several hundred calories a day, and that this variation often has more to do with environment and habit than with any deliberate exercise routine at all. Here's the part that's easy to miss. These communities weren't disciplined about movement. They simply lived in places where sitting still all day was physically difficult to do. Villages were built for walking. Errands required physical effort by default. There was no version of the day that involved getting from a bed to a couch to a car to a desk and back without your body doing real work in between. For most people listening to this in a modern American suburb or city, that environment doesn't exist anymore, which means the habit has to be rebuilt on purpose. Based on what the research actually points to, the highest leverage changes are small and unglamorous, parking farther away than necessary, taking stairs by default, not as an exception, doing yard work yourself instead of paying someone else to do it, standing and pacing during phone calls instead of sitting through them, practicing getting up off the floor without using your hands a handful of times a week as a mobility exercise. None of this requires a gym membership, special equipment, or a training plan. It requires deliberately removing some of the conveniences that let modern life be lived almost entirely while sitting down. A common mistake people make when they hear this research is assuming the opposite lesson, that they need to start an intense new exercise regimen to compensate. The data doesn't really support that either. Several studies on physical activity and mortality risk have found that the biggest drop in health risk happens when someone goes from almost no movement to a modest, consistent amount of daily movement, not when someone goes from moderate activity to extreme athletic training. The returns diminish sharply after a certain point. In other words, the goal isn't to become an athlete. It's to stop being sedentary. The second habit shows up at the dinner table, and it has almost nothing to do with any specific diet plan you've heard of. In Okinawa, there's a centuries-old phrase said quietly before meals, hara, hachi, bu. Roughly translated, it means eat until you are 80% full. It isn't calorie counting, and it isn't a rule enforced by anyone. It's a cultural habit, a pause, a moment of checking in with your body before automatically finishing what's on your plate. Why would stopping slightly short of full actually matter? The strongest evidence here comes from research on caloric restriction in animal models, studies, largely in rodents and primates, showing that consistent, moderate calorie reduction is associated with longer lifespan and lower rates of several age-related diseases. Researchers studying the biology behind this point to processes like autophagy, essentially your cell's internal cleanup and recycling system, which appears to become more active when the body isn't constantly processing a surplus of incoming calories. It's important to be honest about the limits of that evidence, though. Most of the strongest caloric restriction data comes from animal studies under tightly controlled lab conditions, not humans living ordinary lives. Human research on this topic is almost entirely observational, which means it can show a pattern without proving that the pattern causes the outcome on its own. What we can say with more confidence is what these populations were actually eating, because that part of the research is observational, but extremely consistent across all 5 regions. Diets across the blue zones were, on average, somewhere around 90 to 95% plant-based. Legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, soybeans weren't a side dish. They were a daily staple, present in some form at nearly every meal. Refined sugar and heavily processed grains were rare, mostly because they simply weren't widely available in traditional versions of these diets. And meat, when eaten at all, tended to function more like a celebration food, saved for holidays and special occasions, rather than the default center of a plate, the way it often is in a typical American meal. If there's one ingredient researchers point to again and again across every single blue zone, independently, it's legumes. Bletner's research team found that residents across all 5 regions ate roughly half a cup or more of beans, lentils, or similar legumes on a typical day. A detail that shows up far more consistently across these unrelated cultures than any single superfood claim usually does. There's a real-world cautionary tale worth mentioning here, too. As Okinawa modernized over the past several decades, and younger generations shifted toward a more Western, processed diet, researchers tracking the region's health outcomes found that some of the traditional longevity advantage began to narrow in younger cohorts. That's not a controlled experiment, but it's a striking natural example of what happens when the dietary pattern itself changes, even while the genetics of the population stay the same. So what does this actually mean if you live in a typical American city or suburb? Not go vegan tomorrow, and not start counting macros. 2 smaller, more realistic shifts. Build meals around plants and legumes first, and treat meat as an addition rather than the main event. And second, practice actually noticing the difference between satisfied and stuffed, and stopping at the first one, even when there's more food in front of you. The third habit has nothing to do with food or movement at all. It's about who you spend your time with. And the research behind this one is, frankly, more solid than most people expect. In Okinawa, there's a tradition called a moai, a small social group, often formed in childhood, where members commit to checking in on and supporting one another for life. Some of the moais studied by Bletner's team had stayed together for over 90 years. Here's why researchers think a structure like this matters so much for longevity specifically. Health behaviors appear to spread through social networks in a measurable, almost contagious way. One of the most cited studies on this, published in the New England Journal of Medicine by researchers Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler, tracked a large social network over more than 3 decades and found that a person's risk of becoming obese increased significantly if a close friend became obese, even when that friend lived hundreds of miles away and there was no shared environment or food access to explain it directly. Their conclusion was that certain health behaviors move through social connections in a pattern similar to the way an actual contagious illness spreads. In the blue zones, a structure like the moai works as a built-in accountability system that doesn't rely on willpower. Your moai checks on you. There's a social expectation that you show up, stay engaged, and stay connected, which means chronic loneliness, by design, has a much harder time taking hold. That detail turns out to matter more than most people assume. Loneliness and social isolation are independently linked across a large body of research to higher mortality risk, and a major scientific review pooling data from multiple long-term studies found that the size of that risk was comparable to other well-established risk factors like smoking or physical inactivity. This isn't a minor or soft finding. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General released a formal public health advisory specifically naming loneliness and social isolation as a serious, measurable health risk for the broader American population. A strong signal that mainstream public health research now treats this with the same seriousness as diet or exercise. What this means practically: a consistent, recurring social circle isn't a soft nice to have sitting separately from your physical health. Multiple independent lines of research now treat it as a measurable health factor in its own right. The people you spend the most time with are quietly shaping your daily habits, whether you notice it or not, and deliberately building or joining a small group that meets regularly, a walking group, a weekly dinner, a recurring call with the same 2 or 3 friends, may move the needle on long-term health about as much as any single dietary change. The fourth habit is harder to put a number on, but it kept showing up anyway. Almost everywhere researchers looked: having a clear, named sense of purpose. In Okinawa, this concept has a specific word, ikigai, which translates roughly to the reason you wake up in the morning. In the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, locals use a related idea called plan de vida, or life plan, your ongoing reason for being. These weren't treated as vague, feel-good concepts by the people who held them. When researchers interviewed centenarians in both regions, most could state clearly and specifically why they got up each day, caring for great-grandchildren, continuing a craft they'd practiced for decades, tending land that had been in the family for generations, or playing an ongoing, active role in their community. A long-running study out of Japan, tracking large groups of older adults over time, found that people who reported having a clear sense of ikigai had a meaningfully lower mortality risk in the years that followed, compared to those who said they didn't feel they had one, even after researchers adjusted for other health factors. That doesn't prove purpose alone extends life on its own, but it's a striking, repeated association. This may be part of why retirement, as it's commonly practiced in the United States, a single, abrupt stop to almost all structured purpose and social role, often on a specific calendar date, doesn't really exist as a concept in most blue zone cultures. People don't stop contributing. The form of their contribution simply shifts as their bodies change. There's a body of research on retirement itself worth mentioning here too. Some studies tracking health outcomes around the time of retirement have found increased risk of cognitive decline and even mortality in the years immediately following a sudden, complete withdrawal from work and structured social roles, particularly among people whose sense of identity and daily structure was built almost entirely around their job. It's worth being careful with this research, since people who retire for health reasons in the first place can muddy the picture. But the pattern has been replicated often enough that several public health researchers now treat a sudden, total loss of purpose and structure as a genuine risk factor in its own right, separate from simply getting older. What this means practically: purpose doesn't have to come from paid work, and it doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be an ongoing role in your family, a craft you continue refining, a volunteer commitment, or simply being reliably needed by specific people on a specific schedule. The actual risk identified in the research isn't stopping a career. It's the abrupt loss of every form of being needed, all at once, with nothing built to replace it. Even in genuinely low-stress environments, centenarians still experience stress, illness, financial hardship, the loss of friends and family. The fifth habit isn't about avoiding stress altogether, because that's not realistic for anyone. It's about having a dependable daily ritual to release it before it builds up. Across the blue zones, researchers identified specific, repeated rituals that serve this exact function. In Ikaria, a near-universal daily afternoon nap. In Sardinia, a consistent evening gathering with friends, sometimes called a happy hour, built into the daily rhythm rather than reserved for special occasions. In Loma Linda's Seventh-day Adventist community, a structured weekly day fully set aside for rest and reflection. In Okinawa, a brief daily practice of remembering and honoring ancestors. The biological mechanism researchers point to here is chronic inflammation. Short bursts of stress are a normal, healthy part of human physiology. The issue is stress that never gets a chance to fully resolve, day after day, for years. That kind of unrelieved chronic stress is linked across a large body of research to elevated systemic inflammation, which in turn is associated with most of the major age-related diseases researchers track: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, several types of cancer, and accelerated cognitive decline. The Blue Zones habit isn't eliminating stress. It's making sure stress gets processed and released on some kind of daily or weekly schedule, rather than silently accumulating in the background indefinitely. What this means practically is more flexible than people expect. The specific format of the ritual matters far less than its consistency. A short nap, a walk without your phone, a prayer or a meditation practice, a standing weekly call with the same friend. What the research actually rewards is doing something, the same something, on a predictable schedule, rather than waiting to feel like practicing self-care only on the hardest days. To make all 5 of these habits feel less like 5 separate ideas and more like one connected way of living. It helps to walk through what an ordinary day might actually look like for someone living all of them at once. The day starts early, often before sunrise, with movement that doesn't feel like exercise. Tending a garden at ground level, walking to check on animals, or simply walking to visit a neighbor instead of calling them. Midday brings a meal built mostly around legumes and vegetables, eaten slowly, stopping at the first sign of being satisfied rather than finishing everything on the table out of habit. The afternoon includes a deliberate pause, a nap, a quiet sit in the shade, a short period with no obligations at all. Not as an indulgence, but as a routine part of the day. The same way a meal is. By evening, there's a gathering, the moai, the happy hour, the extended family dinner, built into the week as a fixed appointment, not something that only happens when there's nothing better to do. And before the day ends, there's a quiet moment connected to purpose or reflection, a specific reason this day mattered, a role fulfilled, a small contribution made to someone else's life. None of this looks like a wellness routine on a whiteboard. It looks, from the outside, like an unremarkable day. That's precisely the point the original researchers kept emphasizing. None of these communities were optimizing their health on purpose. They were simply living inside an environment and a culture that happened to make these 5 things the path of least resistance. Now let's go back to the honest or harder part of this conversation, because a documentary that only shows the flattering side of its own subject isn't being straight with you. First, the most important caveat: none of these 5 communities credit a specific supplement, a single superfood, or a biohacking protocol of any kind. If a product or pill claims to be the blue zone secret, that claim isn't coming from the actual research. Second, it's worth repeating clearly. This is observational research, not a controlled experiment. Nobody randomly assigned people to live in Sardinia versus a typical American suburb for 70 years and then measured the outcome. Researchers can't fully separate genetics, lifestyle, diet, local environment, and access to walkable, fresh food-rich surroundings from one another. The patterns are real and repeated, but strongly associated with is not the same statement as proven to cause. And third, the point we set aside earlier in this video. In 2024, researcher Saul Justin Newman published an analysis specifically challenging the data quality behind several extreme longevity hotspots around the world. His core argument was that regions with unusually high reported rates of people living past 100 often also have weaker historical record keeping, missing birth documentation, or, in some documented cases, financial incentives like pension payments tied to reported age, which can inflate the apparent number of very old residents without reflecting genuine biological longevity. His work specifically named some regions that overlap with or are adjacent to the original Blue Zones list, and it earned a 2024 Ig Nobel Prize for highlighting just how shaky age verification can be in this kind of research. It's important to be precise about what this controversy does and doesn't undermine. It's a real challenge to some of the more dramatic claims about the sheer number of confirmed centenarians in certain regions. It is not, on its own, a refutation of the separately replicated lifestyle research. The twin studies on genetics versus environment, the New England Centenarian Studies strictly verified cohort, the Christakis and Fowler social network research, or the Surgeon General's loneliness advisory. Those findings stand on their own evidence, independent of how many verified centenarians any single village actually has. So here's the honest, balanced version of the takeaway. The exact number of confirmed supercentenarians in any one Blue Zone region is more contested than popular coverage usually admits. But the underlying behavioral pattern, frequent natural movement, a mostly plant-based diet eaten in moderation, strong and consistent social bonds, a clear daily sense of purpose, and a regular ritual for releasing stress, shows up across multiple independent, separately conducted bodies of research, not just the original Blue Zones project. That's a meaningfully different and more defensible claim than this one village proves the secret to living to 120. Let's bring this all together. Across the people and research we've covered today, 5 behavioral patterns keep showing up independently in the populations that live the longest and stay healthiest the longest. Natural movement built into the unavoidable structure of daily life, not scheduled workouts. Eating until satisfied rather than full, with meals built primarily around plants and legumes. A consistent, accountable social circle that makes loneliness structurally difficult. A clear daily sense of being needed and having a reason to get up. And a dependable daily or weekly ritual for releasing stress before it has a chance to accumulate. None of these require a subscription, a supplement, or a dramatic overnight life overhaul. What they require is rebuilding small, repeatable structures into an ordinary day. the same way these communities did. Almost always without ever framing any of it as deliberate health advice in the first place. If you want the next deep dive in this series, we're going to look at exactly what the blood work of people who live past 100 actually tends to show, and why the specific marker most doctors don't routinely check for might matter more than the ones that get checked every year. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.